It all started on Sunday, December 24th, 1989. As the rest of the world was preparing for Christmas, Liberia plunged into chaos when a small group of rebels crossed into the country from Côte d'Ivoire under the command of Charles Taylor, a former government official. This group, known as the National Patriotic Front of Liberia, NPFL, aimed to overthrow the government of President Samuel Doe, whose regime had become notorious for widespread corruption, ethnic favoritism, and brutal repression. Taylor's fighters, many of whom were teenagers from the Gio and Mano ethnic groups marginalized under Doe's government, initially gained popular support in the region. As the NPFL captured town after town, they presented themselves as liberators from Doe's tyranny. However, the government's response was immediate and ruthless. Liberian troops, dominated by the Kran ethnic group loyal to Doe, launched a violent crackdown on civilians in cities already captured by the rebels, especially targeting Gio and Mano communities. This brutal retaliation only increased support for Taylor's cause. What began as a localized insurgency quickly evolved into a broader civil conflict. Ethnic tensions flared, atrocities multiplied, and Taylor's forces expanded rapidly, eventually encircling Monrovia. His attack on Liberia set in motion a 14-year civil war from 1989 to 2003, leaving a legacy of destruction, loss of over 250,000 lives, war crimes, and deep national trauma. Till this day, Liberia hasn't recovered from the war. To understand these brutal conflicts, one must begin with Liberia's unique historical roots and the deep socio-political fractures that preceded the outbreak of war. The history of Liberia is a very interesting one. Unlike other African nations that came into existence through European colonization, Liberia had a totally different origin. After the abolition of the slave trade, which lasted for over 400 years, a group of American elites, politicians, slaveholders, and abolitionists believed that free African American slaves should be resettled in Africa, so they founded the American Colonization Society to help freed slaves return to their motherland. Some members of the American Colonization Society saw this as a way to spread Christianity and Western civilization to Africa. Others simply wanted to remove freed black people from the United States, fearing they could incite rebellion or destabilize the slave-based economy of the South. In 1821, the American Colonization Society acquired land from local West African leaders under controversial circumstances. Between 1822 and 1865, thousands of freed African Americans were sent to Liberia. These settlers, who came to be known as Americo-Liberians, brought with them American customs, dress, religious beliefs, Western-style education, and governance styles. They established towns and cities resembling those in the United States, especially the southern states, and attempted to recreate a society similar to what they had known or aspired to in America. This included the replication of social hierarchies and class distinctions, even though many of them had once been slaves or descendants of slaves. The first set of settlers struggled with tropical diseases and resistance from the indigenous tribes, but eventually became used to the situation. Despite the fact that these freed slaves had been settled in a new land, the American Colonization Society was still in charge and ruled the land for over 2 decades. By the 1840s, tensions grew between the Americo-Liberians and the ACS. The settlers desired self-rule and control over their economic and political affairs, especially as they faced resistance from indigenous communities and European trading interests along the coast. The ACS, meanwhile, was struggling financially and could no longer support the colony effectively. In response, Liberian leaders, most notably Joseph Jenkins Roberts, a freeborn black man from Virginia and the colony's first black governor, pushed for independence. On July 26, 1847, Liberia declared its independence, becoming the first African republic with Joseph Roberts as its first president. After Joseph became the president of Liberia, tension started between the Americo-Liberia and local Liberians. From the onset of independence, the Americo-Liberians established a monopoly on political power. They considered themselves culturally superior and referred to indigenous Africans as tribals, savages, or uncivilized. The ruling elite viewed their mission as a civilizing one, to uplift the indigenous people through Christianity and Western education. In reality, this was used to justify exclusion and exploitation. The true Whig Party, which came to dominate Liberian politics after 1878, became a symbol of this oligarchic rule. For over a century, it remained the only legal party, turning Liberia into a one-party state, controlled exclusively by Americo-Liberians. Indigenous Liberians were not granted full citizenship and were barred from voting or holding high office until the mid-20th century. The Americo-Liberians administered rural areas through indirect rule, governing indigenous populations via hand-picked local chiefs who reported to the central government. Economically, the Americo-Liberians controlled trade, land ownership, and foreign policy. The economy centered on export commodities such as rubber and palm oil, managed by Americo-Liberian elites and foreign corporations. Indigenous Liberians often worked under exploitative conditions with limited access to the wealth they helped produce, while the political and economic exclusion was overt. Cultural marginalization was equally damaging. The Americo-Liberians sought to erase or diminish traditional African customs. Indigenous languages were discouraged in favor of English, and African religious beliefs were labeled as pagan or primitive. Christianity, particularly Protestantism, became a tool of assimilation. This suppression extended to education. Schools primarily served the settler population and were used to instill Americo-Liberian values. Indigenous children had limited access to formal education unless they converted to Christianity or adapted to Western norms. Indigenous societies, with their rich oral traditions, community structures, and local governance systems, were deemed backward and in need of reform. This cultural imperialism created a sharp psychological divide. Indigenous people saw themselves as second-class citizens in their own land. The Americo-Liberians, though originally victims of oppression in America, had become agents of a new form of internal colonialism. The laws of Liberia further entrenched the divide. Land tenure laws favored Americo-Liberians, while indigenous people were often denied ownership rights or forced to operate within customary systems that limited access to national resources. Citizenship was not automatically extended to indigenous groups until 1904, and even then, full political participation was delayed for decades. Moreover, indigenous people were subjected to a dual legal system. While Americo-Liberians lived under civil law modeled after the US system, indigenous Liberians were governed by customary law, administered through chiefs and tribal councils. This legal separation not only reinforced inequality, but institutionalized it. The government used this system to extract labor, taxes, and loyalty from indigenous communities, while offering minimal services or political rights in return. Despite these oppressive conditions, indigenous Liberians did not remain passive. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, there were scattered uprisings and resistance movements, particularly in the hinterlands. However, these were often localized and swiftly suppressed by the Americo-Liberian government with help from foreign advisors and military support. In the 20th century, the situation began to change as education and political consciousness spread among indigenous youth. Some were able to attend missionary schools or study abroad, gaining awareness of their rights and the injustice of the existing system. These educated individuals began to challenge Americo-Liberian dominance, advocating for reforms, representation, and national unity. By 1980, Liberia was in crisis. The economy had plummeted due to rising oil prices, corruption, and inflation. President William Tolbert, though relatively reform-minded, was losing grip on the situation. In 1979, a protest against the rising cost of rice, the staple food, turned into a riot that killed dozens. The government's violent suppression of the protests further alienated the masses. It took one man called Samuel Doe to put an end to the Americo-Liberian rule. Samuel Canyon Doe was born in 1951 in Tuzon, a small town in Grangede County in southeastern Liberia. He was a member of the Kran ethnic group, one of the many marginalized tribes in the country. Coming from humble beginnings and lacking elite education, Doe's life trajectory was shaped by economic and social struggle. In 1969, at the age of 18, he joined the Armed Forces of Liberia, AFL. Military service was one of the few upward mobility paths available to indigenous Liberians. Over time, he rose through the ranks to become a master sergeant, one of the highest ranks an indigenous man could achieve at the time. His position in the military gave him a clear view of Liberia's inequalities and the opportunity to act. On April 12, 1980, Samuel Doe led a violent coup d'etat with a group of 17 non-commissioned officers from the AFL. They stormed the executive mansion and assassinated President Tolbert. Doe became the first indigenous Liberian to take control of the state. In a horrifying show of power, 13 of Tolbert's ministers were tried and executed on Monrovia's beaches, filmed and broadcast for the entire country to see. The coup marked the end of Americo-Liberian dominance. At first, it was celebrated by many, especially among the indigenous population. Doe established a military junta called the People's Redemption Council, PRC, and promised a new era of justice, equality, and national unity. When Doe took over, instead of building a broad coalition or a representative government, Doe quickly surrounded himself with Kran loyalists who were people from his tribe and began promoting them throughout the military and civil service. This led to widespread resentment from other ethnic groups, especially the Gio and Mano people of Nimba County, who felt sidelined. Doe's regime relied heavily on military strength rather than democratic institutions. Political opponents were jailed, exiled, or killed. The secret police and pro-Doe militias began to harass journalists, intellectuals, and anyone critical of the regime. During the Cold War, Liberia was strategically important to the United States. Doe's staunch anti-communist stance won him generous aid and political protection from Washington, despite growing evidence of human rights abuses and rampant corruption in his regime. Between 1980 and 1985, the US gave Liberia hundreds of millions in military and economic assistance. This external support allowed Doe to maintain control, even as internal dissatisfaction grew. In 1985, under pressure from both Liberians and international allies, Doe agreed to transition back to civilian rule. He lifted the ban on political parties and organized presidential elections. However, the elections were widely rigged. Doe declared himself the winner with 50.9% of the vote, a suspiciously narrow margin that avoided a runoff. Observers from the US and other international bodies called the process deeply flawed. Still, in the name of geopolitical stability, the US and the international community recognized Doe's victory. This emboldened his regime further and led to a wave of crackdowns on political opponents. Just weeks after the 1985 election, General Thomas Kwiwonkpa, a former ally of Doe from the Gio ethnic group, attempted a coup. The plan failed, and Kwiwonkpa was captured and executed. What followed was a brutal ethnic purge. Doe's forces, mostly from the Kran tribe, targeted Gio and Mano civilians in Nimba County, accusing them of supporting Kwiwonkpa. Thousands were killed in ethnic massacres, and tens of thousands fled across the border into Côte d'Ivoire and Guinea. This event was a turning point. Doe's regime had turned from autocratic to openly genocidal. The deepening ethnic divisions sowed the seeds which will lead to the most brutal was in Liberia's history civil war. Charles Taylor was the man who brought an end to Samuel Doe's rule. Born on January 28, 1948, in Arthington, a town near Monrovia, Liberia. He hailed from an Americo-Liberian background, descendants of freed African-American slaves who had ruled Liberia since its founding in 1847. Taylor was raised in a relatively privileged environment and educated at elite schools in Liberia. In 1972, he traveled to the United States, where he later attended Bentley College, now Bentley University, in Massachusetts, studying economics. Though he never completed his degree, his time in the US was formative, exposing him to both American politics and the global currents of the Cold War era. Upon returning to Liberia in the mid-1970s, Taylor became involved in politics and eventually joined the government of President William R. Tolbert, an Americo-Liberian reformist who attempted to bridge the divide between the elite and the indigenous population. Taylor was appointed Director General of the General Services Agency, GSA, responsible for government procurement and supplies. This was a powerful post, and Taylor was accused of embezzling nearly $1 million during his tenure. In 1983, he fled to the US, but was later arrested in Massachusetts at the request of the Liberian government, then under Samuel Doe. He was jailed in a Boston detention center pending extradition, but in 1985, Taylor escaped under mysterious circumstances, reportedly using a bedsheet rope. The details of his escape remain controversial, with some speculating that US intelligence agencies may have had helped him escape so he could return to Liberia and do their bidding, eliminate Samuel Doe. After his escape, Taylor disappeared from the public eye, only to resurface in Libya, where he received guerrilla warfare training under Muammar Gaddafi's revolutionary ideology. Gaddafi, in the 1980s, positioned himself as a patron of Pan-African revolutionaries, training dissidents and militants from across the continent. In Libya, Taylor met Fode Sanko, a Sierra Leonean rebel who would later lead the Revolutionary United Front, RUF. Their alliance would become critical in the cross-border wars to come. Taylor also gathered Liberian exiles and fighters, especially from the Gio and Mano ethnic groups, who had suffered brutal persecution under Doe's regime. In the late 1980s, Charles Taylor established the National Patriotic Front of Liberia, NPFL, a rebel movement with the stated goal of overthrowing Samuel Doe's corrupt and brutal government. Taylor cleverly framed his insurgency as a liberation struggle, promising democracy, justice, and an end to ethnic favoritism. However, Taylor's real strategy was a mix of military conquest, ethnic manipulation, and economic exploitation. His force included fighters from various backgrounds, but its core strength came from Gio and Mano youths, radicalized by past government atrocities. After years of planning, Taylor decided to strike, and his action would lead to a gruesome civil war in Liberia. On December 24, 1989, Taylor and roughly 150 NPFL fighters crossed the Liberian border from Côte d'Ivoire and entered Nimba County, a region dominated by the Gio and Mano people. This marked the start of the First Liberian Civil War. Initially dismissed by the Doe regime, Taylor's fighters quickly gained support among local populations who viewed them as liberators. As the AFL, Armed Forces of Liberia, responded with brutal reprisals and mass killings, the NPFL's support base grew rapidly. Thousands of young men, including child soldiers, mostly between the ages of 13 to 18, were recruited into Taylor's ranks. Within months, the NPFL had taken control of large swathes of eastern and northern Liberia. The conflict soon took an ethnic dimension. The AFL, dominated by Doe's Kran tribe, targeted Geo and Mano civilians, while Taylor's NPFL retaliated against Kran and Mandingo communities. What had started as a rebellion turned into widespread ethnic cleansing. Both sides committed horrific atrocities, massacres, sexual violence, forced conscription of children, and mutilations became common. The war had descended into a brutal, zero-sum conflict with no regard for civilian life. In mid-1990, a major split occurred within the NPFL. Prince Yomi Johnson, a former Taylor commander and fellow Geo tribesman, broke away to form the Independent National Patriotic Front of Liberia, INPFL. Disputes over leadership, spoils of war, and Taylor's authoritarian behavior caused the rift. Prince Johnson's INPFL quickly seized parts of Monrovia and launched a dramatic and brutal offensive against Doe himself. At the climax of the Civil War, Monrovia, the capital city, became a war zone, with three factions: Doe's AFL, Taylor's NPFL, and Johnson's INPFL, vying for control. Amidst this chaos, the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, intervened by deploying a peacekeeping force called ECOMOG to stabilize the situation and facilitate a transition. On September 9, 1990, Doe made a fateful visit to the ECOMOG base at the free port of Monrovia, hoping to negotiate peace. However, Prince Johnson's forces infiltrated the area and captured him. Doe was taken to Johnson's camp, where he was tortured and brutally killed. The gruesome act was videotaped, showing Johnson drinking beer while Doe, bleeding and dismembered, was interrogated. His death marked the definitive collapse of his regime. The fall of Samuel Doe plunged Liberia into a protracted civil war that lasted until 1997. His downfall was the product of political repression, ethnic violence, economic collapse, and a violent rebellion fueled by years of injustice. Rather than bringing peace, his death opened the floodgates to even greater instability, warlordism, and human suffering that would haunt Liberia for over a decade. The death of President Samuel Doe on September 9, 1990, marked the end of his authoritarian regime but did not bring peace to Liberia. Instead, it plunged the country deeper into chaos, factionalism, and full-blown civil war. With Doe gone, a brutal power vacuum emerged. Multiple armed groups vied for control, and no single authority was strong enough to unite or pacify the fractured nation. The main contenders for power were Charles Taylor's National Patriotic Front of Liberia, NPFL, and Prince Johnson's breakaway faction, the Independent NPFL, INPFL. While Taylor controlled most of the countryside, Johnson held strategic parts of Monrovia, the capital. Meanwhile, the remnants of Doe's Kran-dominated military, the Armed Forces of Liberia, AFL, remained active but weakened, mostly confined to areas around the executive mansion. To prevent total collapse, the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, had already intervened by deploying a regional peacekeeping force called ECOMOG, led by Nigeria. However, instead of being welcomed, ECOMOG was viewed with suspicion by Taylor and his NPFL, who accused it of being biased and interfering with Liberian sovereignty. As a result, ECOMOG peacekeepers became combatants in the complex web of fighting factions. In November 1990, ECOWAS installed an interim government of national unity led by Dr. Amos Sawyer, a respected academic. But this civilian government had little real power beyond ECOMOG protected zones. Charles Taylor, controlling about 90% of the country's territory, refused to recognize the interim government, claiming he should be the legitimate leader. This set off a prolonged standoff between the political process in Monrovia and Taylor's military campaign from the bush. From 1990 to 1996, Liberia descended into a nightmare of warlordism, ethnic violence, and humanitarian catastrophe. As more groups joined the conflict, the war fragmented. Major new factions emerged. The ULIMO, United Liberation Movement for Democracy in Liberia, composed mainly of former AFL soldiers and Crown refugees, opposed Taylor. ULIMO later split into ULIMO J, led by Roosevelt Johnson, a Crown, and ULIMO K, led by Alhaji Kroma, a Mandingo, who also began fighting each other. The Liberian Peace Council, LPC, and other local militias formed based on tribal affiliations and regional interests. These groups committed massive human rights abuses, including massacres, sexual violence, child soldier recruitment, looting, and displacement. Entire towns and villages were destroyed. The war killed over 200,000 people and displaced millions, many of whom fled to neighboring countries like Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Côte d'Ivoire. Liberia's infrastructure was devastated. Schools shut down, hospitals closed, roads became impassable, and the economy collapsed entirely. Throughout the early 1990s, ECOWAS and the United Nations attempted to broker peace through a series of agreements, notably the Cotonou, 1993, Akosombo, 1994, and Abuja Accords, 1995. Each one temporarily slowed violence but ultimately failed, as warlords would break the ceasefires, often seeking more power, territory, or leverage. These failures reflected the absence of trust, the deep ethnic divisions, and the war economy that gave incentives for commanders to keep fighting. In 1995, after years of failed negotiations, a new Council of State was established as a transitional power-sharing government. Charles Taylor, Alhaji Kroma, and George Bowley, another warlord, became part of this collective presidency. Though unstable, this arrangement set the stage for elections under international supervision. Finally, in 1997, after 7 years of war, Liberia held general elections. Charles Taylor, running under his National Patriotic Party, NPP, won a landslide victory with 75% of the vote. Many Liberians, exhausted by years of war, believed Taylor's election would end the violence. The phrase, "He killed my ma, he killed my pa, but I will vote for him," became a bitter symbol of the people's desperation for peace. Taylor's victory officially ended the First Liberian Civil War, 1989 to 1997. But it did not bring real stability. Though the guns temporarily fell silent, Liberia remained fractured, traumatized, and under the shadow of warlords turned politicians. Ethnic tensions, unresolved grievances, and Taylor's authoritarian tendencies laid the foundation for the Second Liberian Civil War, which would erupt in 1999. The Second Liberian Civil War, which erupted in 1999, was the violent sequel to the First Civil War that had devastated Liberia throughout the 1990s. Though Liberia had returned to electoral democracy with the election of Charles Taylor in 1997, the peace was deceptive and short-lived. Taylor's rule failed to heal the wounds of the past, and his presidency quickly turned into a new authoritarian regime marked by repression, ethnic persecution, regional meddling, and economic collapse. These conditions, combined with unresolved grievances and the ambitions of rival warlords, created the perfect storm for a return to war. After taking power, Charles Taylor consolidated control with an iron grip. He ruled through fear, eliminating dissent and intimidating opposition. Many of his wartime rivals who had taken part in the transitional government were either exiled, marginalized, or eliminated. He used ex-combatants and former rebels as private security forces, and his government functioned more like a warlord regime than a democratic state. The judiciary was co-opted, and the security forces were loyal only to Taylor. Ethnic favoritism and repression returned, this time with the Geo and Mano ethnic groups, who had supported Taylor during the First War, now facing persecution, especially in the northwest. Meanwhile, Liberia's economy was in shambles. Taylor mismanaged state funds and used natural resources, especially diamonds and timber, to fund his personal power network and regional ambitions. Corruption was rampant. Ordinary Liberians saw little improvement in their lives after the war. Jobs were scarce, basic services were absent, and the country's infrastructure remained in ruins. The population's hope in post-war recovery quickly faded. Taylor also made powerful regional enemies. He became deeply involved in neighboring Sierra Leone's civil war, where he was accused of arming and supporting the Revolutionary United Front, RUF, in exchange for so-called blood diamonds. These actions brought him international condemnation and UN sanctions, including a travel ban and asset freezes. His government was increasingly isolated, with the United States, United Nations, and regional powers withdrawing support. Most importantly, Taylor's support for rebel groups in Sierra Leone and his attacks on Liberian refugees and opposition figures in neighboring countries provoked retaliation. Exiled former fighters and ethnic groups who had been targeted by Taylor's regime regrouped and rearmed in Guinea and Ivory Coast, waiting for their chance to strike back. Two major armed groups emerged from this opposition. 1. Liberians United for Reconciliation and Democracy, LURD, formed in 1999 in Guinea. LURD was composed mostly of Mandingo and Kran fighters, many of whom had fought against Taylor in the First Civil War as members of ULIMO. LURD's leadership claimed they wanted to remove Taylor to restore democracy and end tyranny. However, the group also became known for brutal tactics, including killing civilians and recruiting child soldiers. Second Movement for Democracy in Liberia, MODL. Emerging in 2003 in Ivory Coast, MODL was a splinter group of LURD composed mainly of fighters from southeastern Liberia. MODL had similar goals but operated largely in the south and gained momentum quickly, capturing towns and ports. In mid-1999, LURD launched a full-scale insurgency in northern Liberia, crossing over from Guinea. Fighting erupted in Lofa County, a region strategically located on the borders of Sierra Leone and Guinea. Taylor's forces, now known as the Anti-Terrorist Unit, ATU, and various loyalist militias, responded fiercely. But unlike in the past, Taylor's regime no longer enjoyed the same monopoly on military power or regional support. The rebels gained ground steadily. By 2001, the war was intensifying. Taylor's security forces carried out massacres and repression in response to rebel advances, further alienating civilians. Entire communities fled their homes. The UN imposed arms embargoes and economic sanctions, accusing Taylor of sponsoring terrorism and instability in West Africa. Taylor's global reputation was now that of a pariah. In 2002, Taylor declared a state of emergency, claiming that LURD had infiltrated parts of Monrovia. Heavy fighting erupted in the north and west of the country. LURD fighters moved closer to the capital, bolstered by arms supplies and support from Guinea. Human rights abuses soared on all sides. Schools and hospitals were shuttered. The country was in collapse once again. In the meantime, Model opened a new front in the southeast, attacking through the Ivory Coast. Liberia was now fighting a two-front war, with rebel forces closing in from both directions. By early 2003, the situation had become dire. Monrovia was under siege, civilians were trapped, and humanitarian conditions were catastrophic. Thousands of people were killed or injured, and hundreds of thousands were displaced. The capital became a war zone. Shells and mortars fell indiscriminately. Food and medical supplies were nearly non-existent. As pressure mounted, both domestically and internationally, Taylor's regime began to crack. The Special Court for Sierra Leone issued an indictment against him for war crimes and crimes against humanity for his role in Sierra Leone's civil war. Meanwhile, regional powers, including Nigeria, Ghana, and the United States, pushed for a peace agreement and Taylor's resignation. In June 2003, peace talks began in Accra, Ghana, while fighting continued in Liberia. During the talks, Taylor was publicly indicted for war crimes. Facing international isolation, military defeat, and rebellion from within, Taylor finally agreed to step down. On August 11, 2003, he resigned and went into exile in Nigeria.
That I should exile myself, that my people will live to tell the story tomorrow, and that the goodness will come to this land. I accept the challenge.
Famously declaring, "God willing, I will be back." His vice president, Moses Blah, briefly took power, but the warlords and international community quickly moved to establish a transitional government. The Second Liberian Civil War officially ended with the signing of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, CPA, on August 18, 2003 in Accra. A transitional government was installed, made up of representatives from the major warring factions, civil society, and political parties. A United Nations peacekeeping force, UNMIL, was deployed to maintain order, disarm combatants, and oversee the transition. The war had lasted 4 brutal years and had killed an estimated 50,000 people, adding to the devastation from the First Civil War. Liberia was left shattered, a failed state with no functioning institutions, a traumatized population, and a generation of children who had known nothing but war. Liberia emerged from its 2 civil wars, spanning 1989 to 2003, as one of the most devastated nations in the world. The wars were not just violent, they were catastrophically transformative, dismantling nearly every political, economic, and social structure in the country. Liberia became a symbol of state failure, a place where government institutions collapsed, entire generations grew up in militarized chaos, and the national psyche was scarred by atrocity and trauma. The aftermath of the first, 1989 to 1997, and second, 1999 to 2003, Liberian civil wars left the country physically ruined, socially fragmented, and economically broken. But the most lasting impact was psychological. Deep mistrust between ethnic groups, a generation of former child soldiers, and a fragile peace held together by international presence rather than national cohesion. After the First Civil War ended in 1997 with Charles Taylor's election, Liberia was already in ruins. An estimated 200,000 people had died, over 1.5 million were displaced, and the infrastructure of the state, roads, hospitals, schools, electricity, had collapsed. Monrovia, the capital, looked like a ghost city. Buildings shelled and burned, streets cratered, and businesses shuttered. The countryside was controlled by former warlords and bandits, and access to basic necessities like food and clean water was sporadic at best. Though the war had ended on paper, real peace was elusive. Taylor's government resembled a militarized kleptocracy more than a democratic regime, and ethnic tensions remained high. Instead of reconciliation and reconstruction, Taylor's regime deepened the wounds of war through political repression, cronyism, and regional adventurism. By the end of the 1990s, Liberia was sliding back into chaos. The Second Civil War was both a continuation and an intensification of unresolved conflicts from the first. It further devastated Liberia's social and physical infrastructure, leading to the deaths of another 50,000 people and displacing more than 1 million. When the guns finally fell silent in August 2003, Liberia was a failed state in every sense of the term. It had no functioning economy, no education system, no formal justice system, and no credible national army or police. Armed groups and warlords had divided the country into fiefdoms, and the rule of law was replaced by the rule of the gun. An entire generation of Liberian youth had grown up knowing only war, with thousands of former child soldiers now traumatized, uneducated, and unprepared for civilian life. The Comprehensive Peace Agreement of 2003 ushered in a transitional government, heavily supervised by the international community, especially the United Nations. The United Nations mission in Liberia, UNMIL, deployed over 15,000 peacekeepers, marking one of the largest peacekeeping operations in the world at the time. UNMIL's presence helped stabilize Liberia and disarm over 100,000 combatants through a nationwide DDR, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration program. However, the reintegration of ex-combatants into society was uneven and often inadequate. Many former fighters returned to lives of poverty and marginalization, breeding resentment and criminal activity in urban centers. In 2005, Liberia took a historic turn when Ellen Johnson Sirleaf was elected president, becoming the first democratically elected female head of state in Africa. Her election symbolized hope and a commitment to rebuild, reconcile, and reform. Under her leadership, Liberia began the slow process of reconstruction. International aid poured in, and debt relief programs were implemented. Roads were rebuilt, schools reopened, and health systems began functioning. A new army and police force were trained from scratch with international support. Democratic institutions were re-established, and the media environment improved. However, the post-war recovery was not without major challenges. The Truth and Reconciliation process struggled. Liberia's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, produced a report in 2009 documenting widespread atrocities and recommending prosecutions of key war actors, including Charles Taylor and others who held political office. Yet political will to follow through was weak. While Taylor was eventually tried and convicted by an international court in The Hague for crimes committed in Sierra Leone, not Liberia, most of Liberia's warlords and perpetrators of violence remained free, and in some cases, politically active. This lack of accountability sent a troubling message. War crimes could be forgiven if one was politically useful. Economically, Liberia remained highly dependent on foreign aid and investment. The country's formal economy, based primarily on rubber, iron ore, and timber, struggled to attract sustainable investment due to ongoing corruption, poor infrastructure, and weak institutions. Youth unemployment remained dangerously high, with over 60% of the population under the age of 25, most without access to stable jobs or quality education. This demographic pressure continues to threaten Liberia's long-term stability. Socially, the country faced the monumental task of healing divisions between ethnic groups, especially the Kran, Geo, Mano, and Mandingo communities, who had been pitted against each other in the wars. Inter-ethnic mistrust persisted, especially in rural areas. Moreover, large segments of the population suffer from untreated psychological trauma. Mental health services remain severely underfunded and inaccessible for most Liberians. One of the most profound legacies of the wars is the erosion of trust in government and institutions. Years of warlordism, coups, and dictatorship have made Liberians wary of political leaders. Corruption and nepotism continue to plague the political system. Despite elections in 2011 and a peaceful transfer of power in 2017 to President George Weah, many Liberians feel that their leaders have failed to deliver justice, development, or reform. Public confidence in democracy is shaky, and the memory of war is never far from the national consciousness. Today, Liberia is at peace, but it remains fragile. The civil wars redefined the country's social fabric, weakened its institutional capacity, and reshaped how Liberians see each other and the state. The wars interrupted development, wasted generations of human capital, and normalized violence as a means of resolving conflict. While the physical destruction of war has largely been addressed through reconstruction, the emotional, psychological, and institutional damage lingers. Yet amid these challenges, Liberia has also shown resilience. Civil society organizations have grown stronger. Young Liberians are increasingly engaged in civic discourse. There is a burgeoning arts and culture scene. The peaceful elections of 2017 and 2023 demonstrated that Liberia could change leadership without bloodshed. International partners continue to support Liberia's development, even as donor fatigue sets in. Ultimately, the legacy of Liberia's civil wars is a sobering reminder of how quickly a nation can unravel and how difficult it is to rebuild. The wars left scars on the land and in the hearts of its people. They reshaped the country's identity, and they continue to influence every aspect of political, social, and economic life. Liberia today stands not as a post-conflict success story, but as a work in progress, trying to balance peace with justice, memory with reconciliation, and the lessons of the past with the hope for a better future. To conclude, Liberia's journey through the darkness of war was one of unimaginable pain, but it is not the end of her story. From the ashes of destruction, a new Liberia is slowly but surely emerging. Scarred, yes, but unbroken. A generation that once knew only the sounds of gunfire is now raising their voices for peace, for justice, and for progress. Once fractured by hate, the nation is learning again how to forgive, how to heal, and how to hope. The road ahead is long and uncertain, but it is not without light. Liberia has witnessed the worst of humanity, but in her people, we see the best. In the children returning to school, in the women rebuilding communities, in the youth who reject violence for dialogue, and in every hand that plants a seed instead of holding a weapon, there lies the promise of a better tomorrow. Liberia's past need not define her future. Though the wounds run deep, they do not have to remain open. With resilience in their hearts and unity in their steps, Liberians are proving that peace is not just a dream. It is a choice, and they are choosing it every day. This is the beginning of a new chapter, one of dignity, rebuilding, and hope. Thanks for watching this video. Hope you now have a better understanding of what happened in Liberia. If you enjoyed watching this video, please share it with your friends. Also, let us know in the comment if you have been to Liberia before, and what are your thoughts about the country. The best comment will be pinned. Also, do not forget to subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in our next one.